Friends, I hope this doesn't look too much like a congressional hearing, because it sort of feels that way. We just need the people in the back that we lean over and talk to, the deal. But we set it up this way because it is live streamed. It would be difficult, really the most comfortable would probably be in the round, just to talk to one another that way. But we set it up this way, so first of all, you would know who the members of the delegation are that are here. And since we're live streaming this, then it's just easier to do what we need to do to get that done. So that's why we're set up in this kind of formal format. The purpose of our meeting tonight is really what it says. It's a listening post. And so there will be a little bit of presentation because Tom Harkrider and I, who are the first elected clergy and lay person, every other year it alternates every other quadrennium, it alternates who is head of the delegation. Clergy, one quadrennium, first elected lay, the next, and so forth. And so it is the clergy turn. Tom chaired the delegation last time, and I chaired the delegation the time before that. And so that's the way that works. And so Tom and I will do a presentation a little bit on General Conference, what's coming up, so that we kind of have a basis for our conversation, and then we'll talk. There is a web address that people can access the conference website, but there's an email address as well that you can use to communicate to the delegation after this meeting or at any time during. And during the meeting, one member of our delegation, Mary Spradlin, will be checking the emails, and so if somebody wants to email in who is joining us on the live stream, well, then they can do that. The purpose is Q&A, if that's what we need, some Q&A for clarification or for, just to understand what's going on. But mainly, if you have something you want to share with the delegation, we want to hear from you, your ideas and opinions and understanding and your convictions and so forth. So appreciate you being here, and please spread the word that we're having 2 more of these. They will be in other parts of the annual conference, in Temple and in Stephenville. And that information is on the conference website as well when those are. And I think they're in 2 weeks from this week. Okay, I'm going to ask Darcy Dupree, a member of the delegation, to lead us in prayer as we begin.
If you'll join me, please. Gracious and loving God, please be with us this evening, and as the members of the delegation travel to Portland, help guide us to be both listeners and to be deep thinkers and understanders, and help us to represent all of those members here of the Central Texas Conference, and also help us to understand each other and guide us through these times as we focus on the direction of the United Methodist Church. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Also, there's the usual beginning of a meeting. Please silence your cell phones too, as well. Thank you. Tom Harkrider put together a really helpful presentation, and that's what we'll be going through just as a kind of introduction to General Conference, if you need that. If not, it'll be a refresher perhaps. And then also just some of the main issues coming up. And so, Tom, here's the clicker if you want to.
You can trust me with that.
I
okay.
Will.
And obviously we had the same problem in Portland when I was making the presentation, and it wasn't cooperating. So there we go. All right. The theme for General Conference is Therefore Go, and it's actually comes from that passage from Matthew 28. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. And look, I myself will be with you every day until the end of the present age. And I think those of us on the delegation, especially those who have been to General Conference before, take a lot of solace in that last line, that Jesus will be with us every day until the end of that present age. But this does embrace our mission as a United Methodist Church of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world, and how we engage the world in that process. The annual conference, or General Conference, will be in Portland, Oregon this time, and it starts on the 10th of May and will go through the 20th of May. The first week of this process is actually legislative committees. The second week will be plenary session with all of the delegates coming together for that time. And I'm still fighting this. Just a little bit about our organization and how things, how do folks get to General Conference, and what does the representation look like there? We are a connectional church as a United Methodist denomination. In the United States, there are over 32,000 local churches. Outside the United States, there are over 11,000 churches. Each of those churches are a part of an annual conference. Here in our area, we are part of the Central Texas Annual Conference. And there are 56 annual conferences within the U.S. Outside of the U.S., there are 76 annual conferences. And then within the United States, those annual conferences are further grouped together in what are called jurisdictions. And there are 5 jurisdictions represented within the U.S. Outside the United States, currently, the way that is structured is those 76 annual conferences are all a part of 7 different central conferences. And you can see by the map here when it comes up, hopefully. You can see outside the U.S. Where those central conferences are, and that's in African Central, Congo, West Africa, Philippines, Germany, Northern Europe and Eurasia, and then Central and Southern Europe. And you can see the membership numbers are there, and I've just totally killed it, I guess. But as each of those annual conferences that you saw there throughout the world elect delegates to the General Conference, and so that's based upon the membership within each of those annual conferences. Here's kind of the breakdown of the delegation count. There's a total of 864 delegates that will be coming to Portland this time. 504 of those will be coming from the U.S., 260 from the African nations, 50 from the Philippines, 40 from Europe and Eurasia, and 10 from concordant relationships, and these are just some churches that have a special relationship with the United Methodist Church. So there'll be a total of 864 voting delegates at General Conference this time. And that's down a little bit from last time. Do you want to talk about the structure a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, the United Methodist Church is structured in a similar way to the United States government. In a sense, the United Methodist Church, that is the Methodist movement in the United States, grew up along with the government of the United States, and so there are some similarities because some of those things developed together at about the same time. And one of those aspects is it is representational. There is a legislative branch, that's the General Conference. There's an executive branch, you can say, which is the Council of Bishops. And then there is the judicial branch, which is the Judicial Council, which is often compared and with some accuracy to the Supreme Court of the United States. So that is that's the constitutional structure of the church, how the church is structured. And then we are governed by a book of discipline. The book of discipline is what comes out of each General Conference. Every 4 years, General Conference writes the book of discipline. That is, amends it in parts. Adds parts, takes parts away, changes parts of the discipline. All of that is done in a legislative process. And the book of discipline has these parts to it, these sections of the book of discipline, and the first of those is the Constitution. And you can see those other parts there. We don't want to get bogged down in too much detail here, but all of these parts of the discipline are, it's possible to amend those at General Conference. Now, to amend the Constitution, the General Conference is just the first part of that process. If there's a 2/3 vote at General Conference, then it goes to the annual conferences for ratification. And so any constitutional amendments have to be ratified by the annual conferences. 2/3 of all of those voting in aggregate, not 2/3 of the annual conferences voting approval, but 2/3 of all the votes cast by members of the annual conferences. That's what it requires to amend the Constitution. Then here is just, again, a look at how those sections are in certain paragraphs. And certain paragraphs are assigned to certain legislative committees for that first week of work. So each of these sections, parts of these sections will be assigned to committees. And the committees are dealing with petitions. The petitions are submitted to the General Conference in the fall, early fall, prior to the General Conference. And then those petitions are organized by a petitions committee. They're assigned to committees. And then though they can be reassigned and swapped around a little bit by that committee, but pretty much that's set before the General Conference sessions begin. And those committees then deal with the legislation as it is presented to them. Yeah, there's the General Conference process. And there are 1,044 petitions that the conference will deal with. They will, the legislative committees, as Tom mentioned in that first week, will consider those petitions, and you can see the actions they can take: approve, amend, reject, or refer. And then it goes on to the plenary session the next week, which votes on the committee recommendations. And then, as I mentioned, if it involves a constitutional amendment, it has to be ratified by annual conferences. These are the committees: Church and Society, 1 and 2, conferences, Discipleship, Faith and Order, Financial Administration, General Administration, Global Ministries, Independent Commissions, Judicial Administration, Local Church, and Ministry and Higher Education Superintendency. And by reading the titles of those legislative committees, you can get some sense of what they are dealing with in terms of subject matter. Okay, Tom, you want to?
Yeah, one of the things that will be one of the primary focuses of this General Conference, and it has been really for several General Conferences since about 2008, is the global nature of church. As the United Methodist denomination is growing, particularly in Africa, you saw some of the numbers there, the membership there. We have to address the question: how do we operate as a global church? A lot of our structure was designed back when the merger happened back in the 60s, where we saw the U.S. as the kind of the mother church, and then we had these missional churches outside the U.S. And now with the growth outside the United States, this General Conference, almost 40% of the delegates will be coming from outside the United States. By 2020, we may see the actual shift in that to where the majority of the delegates are coming from outside the U.S. And yet at the General Conference, we have to deal with all of the legislation and all of the for the whole church. And so one of the challenges becomes so much of what we're doing at General Conference is U.S.-centric, because that's kind of how we started, and some of the issues dealing with pensions and ministerial issues and property rights and those type of things that have some very specific U.S.-centric ties to them. We have everybody in the world taking action on those, and yet they don't really pertain to everyone outside the U.S. And so how do we become truly a global church, and what does that look like? And so one of the things that one of the questions that we're asking is, what is it, particularly in the midst of the differences in cultures that we see throughout the world? And you can pick up the newspaper and see that, the legal differences, the cultural differences throughout the world. How do we discern who we are as United Methodists? And so the question becomes, what are the essentials that bind us as United Methodists? What are those things that hold us together as a people called United Methodist. And then as we look at the Book of Discipline, which is should be our guide for how do we make disciples of Jesus Christ, what are the parts of the Book of Discipline that are global, that pertain to all of us throughout the world as United Methodist, and then what pieces of that need some adaptation for a local or a more regional ministry context. And so there's some decisions that need to be made closer to the mission field, and those decisions are going to look different in Zimbabwe than they are in San Francisco, than they are in Munich or other places. And then the other big question that we'll be addressing at this General Conference particularly is, where are the issues that are solely related to the U.S. addressed? As I mentioned, right now, we have to address all of those at General Conference. An interesting thing is that we have a provision that the central conferences, which you'll remember are those annual conferences that are outside the U.S., they have the ability to adapt the Book of Discipline for their regional ministry context. The U.S. does not have that ability because we don't really have a place that we can do that. And so what has happened is we have folks from throughout the world who vote on the Book of Discipline. The U.S. church is bound by that Book of Discipline, but those churches outside the U.S. can adapt it for their regional ministry context. And so there's an equality issue there that we're having to address, and we'll visit a little bit about that as we continue here. One of the things that we started in 2008 or 2012, I'm sorry, was the Global Book of Discipline. And there actually, if you'll look in the Book of Discipline, there's a paragraph 101, which is the Global Book of Discipline, and it's just about a few paragraphs long, but it's really a placeholder for what is unveiling over really the next two general conferences as we begin to live into this Global Book of Discipline and looking at those questions of what are those things that we hold together as United Methodists. And so we'll continue to be looking at that here at General Conference in 2016. And actually, it's a two-phase process of enacting this Global Book of Discipline. And we'll be looking at some of those sections this time, and then the rest of those in 2012. Again, one of the things that we'll be looking at is this idea of a global general conference, and how do we find a space to address the U.S.-centric issues, so that general conference truly becomes a place of holy conferencing, where we can talk about those issues that pertain to us as United Methodists throughout the world. We look at some of the things that are happening, and you may have read of some of the things happening in the Congo right now, or Angola and some of the other places, and we really don't have a place to sit down and talk about how do we as a church respond to those issues, other than through legislative processes. And so what does it look like if General Conference truly becomes a place of holy conferencing? And so that's one of the focus that we're kind of living into. And then, as I mentioned, the other question is addressing the question, where do we deal with these U.S.-centric issues? There are a number of proposals on the table to address at this time, and we'll probably, hopefully, take some steps toward that today. And there are a few of those. In fact, Ethan and I were just on a conference call with some other members of the conference's legislative committee from throughout the U.S., talking about some of these different proposals. One of them that's on the table is actually coming out of the Central Texas Conference and the North Texas Conference delegations, and it's called A Place of Reason. And it actually has Dr. Brewster's name on it going forward. So if something happens to it, it's all his fault. But if it goes through, we'll take responsibility for it. But what it does is create a U.S. Central Conference, much like the Central Conferences outside the U.S., but it just creates a space for us to deal with just U.S.-centric issues. And that conference would meet prior to or after General Conference, in connection with General Conference. So we can pull all of those U.S.-centric issues out, deal with those in this U.S. Central Conference, which frees the General Conference time up to really dealing with the global issues of the church, and hopefully reducing the time of General Conference and the cost of General Conference. And so there could be some financial savings in this as well in the long term, but primarily giving us a place to really have those conversations. You can find out more about our proposal on this. We have a website called aplaceofreasonumc.org, and you can read some more about that. And Ethan might want to speak up on this, but we were very encouraged with the conversations we had with members of the legislative committee, the traction that we're getting behind this proposal. And we weren't sure about that, but we're kind of excited about that because it's the first time that we as a delegation have actually put some legislation forward. So it seems like that which would be a major move forward for us as a denomination. Again, the organizational structure, there are a couple of other things out there. There's another proposal from the Northeast jurisdiction that would actually create, it's a little more comprehensive. Some of those of you who have been around for a while know back in 2008 we had the worldwide nature of the church legislation, which actually passed General Conference, and it would have created regional. Basically, the central conferences outside the U.S. and then the U.S. would have become a regional conference, and it would have created this type of structure back in 2008. General Conference passed it, but it was not ratified in the annual conferences by 2/3 vote. And so that kind of has sent us back to try to figure out how do we take another road toward this, which is one of the reasons that we put forward this legislation on a place of reason, is to try to embrace that piece that we feel has been sustained throughout the years. Again, there are several other proposals that look at the structure as well. Some of those look at reforming. Some of the things that dealing with structure are reforming some of the general agencies. There's Plan UMC Revised. Some of you, if you followed the last General Conference, we had a little turmoil there when Judicial Council kind of overruled what we had passed, and we were scrambling around to try to fix that problem. And Plan UMC was what we had passed, and then it was ruled unconstitutional. There's a group that has tried to fix the constitutionality problems there, and so that legislation will be introduced again, and some of that will involve combining some of the agencies like COSRO and GCOR together, which was part of the original proposal, and there's some other pieces to that. Another organizational piece that we'll be looking at is reforming Judicial Council, and some legislation around that. The Council on Bishops looking at possibly term limitations. Currently, there's a difference throughout the world in how bishops are elected and how long their term is. In the U.S., once a bishop is elected, they're elected for life. In some places, a bishop is elected for 4 years, then they have to be re-elected, and if they're re-elected, then they're elected for life. And then there's others where they have to be elected each time. So there's some move there to try and limit the terms of bishops, and so at the end of their term they would actually go back to the annual conference in which they were elected from. So we'll see how that goes. Some other pieces, we're reforming clergy leadership and accountability. Part of that has to do with some of the ministry issues, and there's some other folks here that can probably speak to this more clearly than I can, but part of that is creating the earlier ordination, changing the ordination process so that folks are ordained at commissioning instead of being commissioned and then ordained later. They would be actually ordained at the beginning of the process. And so it was shortening that time up. Right now it takes about 10 years for someone to go through the process to become a minister in the United Methodist Church, and sometimes longer than that. And so we're trying to shorten that. Well, 7 now, yeah. We did make some changes, but so we're trying to figure out how to change that. The other issue that we're running into is a lot of places can't afford full-time elders just because of the pension and the health benefits. And so we're seeing an increase in local pastors in those places. And so how do we credential those folks? Because we need folks in the pulpits and serving in those places of ministry. So how do we credential those folks and create opportunities for shortening that process so that they can be appropriately credentialed, but not being onerous in that prospect? Another piece that has been at, I guess, every annual conference or general conference that I've been to is the guaranteed appointment issue. Right now, once clergy are ordained, they're guaranteed an appointment. That the issues there become issues of effectiveness, and what happens when you have a clergy person that becomes ineffective, and how do they exit from the process? Because right now there's really not a good way to exit persons from that process gracefully, and so that will be there's some legislation regarding that as well. Again, the improved course of study and some relationship with the seminaries, again, related to some of the things I just mentioned. Another piece that's related to organizational structure is fair representation, and making sure that we have equity in the representation on all of our boards and agencies and general conference, given the fact that we are a global church. You want this one, or you want me to take it?
Either way. I mean, I'm fine with taking it. You all can jump in and help with it.
Sure.
But human sexuality, of course, will probably receive the most press coverage. It always does, and often the other aspects of the ministry of the United Methodist Church really don't get covered much. But there are. This is an area with which we have wrestled for a long time, and it has created a lot of divisions within the church, a lot of anxiety. Every 4 years, this is really ramped up, and so there are some possibilities of what is coming at General Conference, what can happen at General Conference. And the first of those would be, of course, no changes, that everything would remain as it is. The statements about human sexuality would remain. Then there is another proposal that would remove the restrictive language on ordination, on same-gender marriage being performed in the local in a local United Methodist Church and by United Methodist clergy. It would remove the restrictive language, and the local pastor would decide on what marriages to perform, and the local church would decide perhaps in its wedding policies or in some other formal way. There are different proposals. Whether those would take place within the congregation. And the Board of Ordained Ministry in an annual conference would decide on the issue of ordination. And this is called the third way, and it comes out of the connectional table, which is a gathering of the leadership of the church that coordinates the ministries of the church. It's not, in charge of the church. It doesn't have that kind of function, but rather it is a coordinating and communicating body of the church. And then another option that is on the table that's in petitions is to decide regionally or biannual conference these matters. Another one is the covenantal unity plan. Tom, you're going to have to speak to that. I'm less familiar with that one.
The CUP plan has a couple of components to it. One would be that there is basically a 2 strikes and you're out kind of policy that if a pastor conducted a same-sex union in their local church, they would be suspended for a year without pay, and then the second offense, then they would automatically surrender credentials. So it puts a punitive piece in that. And then there's another piece to that, and Ethan might be able to speak to this a little bit too, but there's another piece to it that would that creates some structural, actually some structural difference, I think, to that as well. And
both the covenantal unity plan and the amicable unity plan are both sort of separate ideas to look at this from a jurisdictional way, so sort of dividing across possibly creating two jurisdictions, possibly creating some similar jurisdictions where different annual conferences can relate in different ways to each other based on just this one issue of sexuality. And they get a little more complex than that, but basically it's related around affiliations and boundary lines.
Mm-hmm. And there's some other legislation that would allow that decision to be made by annual conferences, and annual conferences would have to choose whether they wanted to be a part of a more progressive jurisdiction or a more conservative. We, in our conference call today, we don't think there's a lot of traction behind some of those, and that gets into this amicable unity plan. There's actually, Chris Ritter has actually 3 different proposals out there that are talking about setting up these affinity type of conferences or jurisdictions. And I don't think anybody, I don't have a sense that there are a lot of folks that are very supportive of that moves us closer to schism, and I don't think there's a lot of folks that have a lot of interest in that at this point. And there's a lot of problems with that of how you start to divide things up. The covenantal unity plan does have a component where it would allow for churches to vote to leave the denomination and to move out, and there is a process for that. And again, there's that creates some other issues. And then, as the last piece here, there are a number of other petitions that are related to human sexuality that we'll be dealing with in different legislative committees in different ways. Some of the other issues that we'll be addressing at General Conference, the budget of just over $600,000. In fact,
Million.
Yeah, well, I wish. Connectional Table and GCFA, the General Conference on Finance and Administration, recently met and affirmed the budget that's been proposed, and that's about a 1.4% increase. There still is a big push to reduce the budget even more, and so we'll have those conversations as well. Another issue is the ability for General Conference to delegate authority. Again, this was some issues that we came up with Judicial Council decisions, and that kind of blew up last time. And to what degree can General Conference delegate authority in between General Conference sessions? Because we tend to move when you meet only every 4 years for 2 weeks, it's hard to get a lot of movement. And so there's some more issues around that. Local church flexibility and allowing for more creative forms of ministry. Again, we've been living into that for a while, and there have been some proposals on that in the past, and we're just continuing to live into that. You see some of these other issues there that are just some of the pieces of legislation that will be possible or that would be presented to us. There are about 70 different social justice petitions, and those range from everything from climate change to human trafficking to divestment issues, which most of those are related to some of the Mideast issues. Sustainability and social responsible investments with fossil fuels. There's a lot of conversation there. Then, of course, we'll have some issues regarding sanctity of life and abortion rights issues as well, which we have each time. And then there's some aspects, as I mentioned earlier, that this General Conference will be kind of the part one of two-part General Conference. There are some things that we'll be dealing with in 2016 that we'll finish up in 2020. The Global Book of Discipline, as I mentioned, is going to be one piece of that. Social principles will be another. The structure, again, is another piece that will be kind of a stair-stepped approach. And another one that's kind of interesting is a new hymnal. And they're looking at actually a cyber-type hymnal, a digital hymnal, which they presented this. Tim and I were in Portland in January and saw a pretty detailed presentation on that. And they're just looking for affirmation to move forward with this. But you actually could basically design your own hymnal with what hymns you wanted in it, and it's kind of an interesting concept.
And you could have a
and you could have a printed copy if you wanted, or you could have a digital, you could have it all digital. So really some interesting things of how they're looking at using
it. Would be the first
technology.
denominational hymnal done that way.
Yeah. And so these are the folks who are representing you, and you see some of those faces here in front of you. And I guess
It's a good opportunity.
Be a good time for us to introduce
everybody.
themselves.
Yeah. So we'll start down. Kathy, I want to start down with you, and you can introduce yourself.
And you might share which legislative committee you'll be serving on or be shadowing as well.
Okay, I'm Kathy Zell. I am an alternate to jurisdictional. I'm shadowing higher ed and ministry. I work for the conference office, and my home church is Keller, UMC.
My name's Lewis Carr. I'm an alternate to a jurisdictional, currently doing the shadowing for finance and administration, currently serving at Harvest United Methodist in Fort Worth.
I'm Jim Connor. I'll be shadowing higher education and ministry. I'm a jurisdictional delegate, and I'm currently serving at Genesis United Methodist Church.
I'm Chris Hayes, and will be working with Dr. Brewster, General Administration, and the joys that are in that committee. And I serve as the pastor at Keller United Methodist.
Tom Harkrider, and I'll be from Arbor Lawn United Methodist here in Fort Worth, and I'll be serving on the conference's legislative committee.
And I'm Tim Brewster here at First Church, and I'll be serving on general administration.
I'm Steve McIver from First Ferris, and I will be serving on the local church committee at General Conference.
I'm Ethan Gregory. I'm the first lay reserve to General Conference, shadowing Tom on the conferences committee, and I'm a member at and serve at Arbor Lawn United Methodist here in Fort Worth.
I'm Mary Spradlin. I'm a reserve delegate for jurisdictional conference, and I'm the pastor at Arlington Heights United Methodist Church, and I will be shadowing the Faith and Order Committee.
I'm Deborah Crumpton, and I'm the pastor of St. Andrew's United Methodist Church. I'm a delegate to jurisdictional conference, and I'll be shadowing on global missions.
I'm Darcy Dupree, and I'm a jurisdictional conference delegate, and I'm a member here at First Fort Worth.
And just a word of explanation, that shadowing, that is for those who are not members of the general conference delegation, then they work on the committees, watching the committees, monitoring the committees, keeping the delegation informed, helping with, if we have a person on the committee, then helping that person. Otherwise, keeping informed about the work of that committee and helping the delegation understand the legislation coming out of that committee. Everybody, whether general conference elected to general delegation or the jurisdictional delegation or reserves to jurisdictional conference, are all members of the delegation and all participate and help with the work of the delegation at every level. And the general conference website is up there on the screen for you. There is a mobile app as well, and there is the email address that I mentioned earlier. If you want to communicate to the delegation, that is the dedicated email address for us. So we
and then there also will be a I don't have the website link here, but if you go to the conference website, you can find a link to a site that Jason Valendi, who's a member of our delegation, has set up on Rebel Mouse. I think it's Rebel Mouse or I think it's GC 2016 rebelmouse.com. And you can find a lot of links there to some of the issues that we've talked about. That will also be the place that we'll be posting some videos and some blogs from our delegation during General Conference, so you can kind of keep up with what's happening there. But you can have access to that from the conference website. at ctcumc.org. And then, of course, you can, if you're into Facebook and Twitter, hashtag UMCGC is the official General Conference feed.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So now we want to move to no, that's good. Yeah, there is a prayer ministry. There's always a prayer ministry at General Conference, and then there's always a time of preparation. And we're in that time now of 60 days. You can sign up to receive a daily devotional at Upper Room. And I don't know if there's a link on the conference website for that or not, but we can. Beg your pardon?
You can get the devotionals by email or text message.
Okay, email or text. Yeah. And so you can find that on the General Conference website. You'll see a link to that there. I point back there, but it's okay. So now we want to move to opportunity for you to talk to the delegation if you have questions about what we've presented, and then also to have an opportunity to address things. And there are microphones, and if you'll just raise your hand, and a microphone will come to you magically. Yeah.
Can you explain how the number of delegates are chosen? Because if you go back to the screen, I believe it said in Africa there were about 3,000 members.
No, there are.
Of the African church. Can you go to that screen in case my eyes
No,
there are more members.
There's more,
Many more
there's a
members.
million or so in the Congo alone.
Did I say what I said?
You said 3,000.
3 million.
3 million. Yes.
Pardon me. It's been
It
a
is
long day.
representative in a sense, but also every annual conference gets a minimum of 2 delegates, and central conferences have annual conferences.
76 conferences, did I see some?
Yeah, yes, and so
Here, can I finish my question?
Oh, sure.
Thanks.
I thought that was your
that's
question.
okay. I interrupt too, so it's okay. If there are 3 million people who are members in Africa, and there are nearly 12 million in the United States, can you explain why in the United States we have 504 delegates and Africa has approximately half the number of delegates? So can you explain how they come up? Is it because of this 2 per?
It is. That's kind of what I thought you were getting at. It is the issue of minimum representation. And so what happens is a central conference can create as many annual conferences as they want.
And if you look at
Essentially.
Philippines, that's what's happened with Philippines.
Right.
It's there. Each of the islands has basically set up an annual conference on each of those. So they may have the annual conference may have 1,000 people in it, but they get 2 delegates because they're a separate annual conference.
Right.
Thank you,
And
because
so,
logically, when I looked at that, I thought based on membership, the United States should have 4 times the number of delegates, but that makes sense.
Yeah, that's.
And I
one-
was wondering why they had 76 and we had 56.
That's right.
Okay.
We don't
It's-
have 12 million.
No, we don't. We have.
It had
we
11
have-
million something, didn't it?
No,
Okay,
I
can
think
you
we
go to
have
that
9.
screen?
Do we have 8 or 9?
8 or 9.
About
Yeah.
9. Yeah.
12 may be the total United Methodist
Yeah.
globally.
Yeah, we have, within the 5 jurisdictions, there's 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, about 8 to
Okay,
9 million.
my eyes were wrong.
Yeah, 8 to 9. But still, that there is that principle that operates as well, and that is this
So we should
minimum
have 3
represent-
times as many. But now I understand.
Yeah, if it was, I guess you could say if it was more like the House of Representatives only, but it's kind of a hybrid between the House of Representatives and the Senate in a sense, because you have this minimum. So an annual conference, even if it has 1,000 members, can get 2 delegates.
So that's something that could be changed in the future? Or
There's been
not?
legislation
Okay.
before to
Okay.
deal with that. In fact, the fair representation folks that you mentioned earlier, and some of the legislation coming out of that has also tried to address that issue as well.
Another issue there is how membership numbers are reported. In the U.S., that's reported by the churches, and that comes in. In other parts of the world, the bishops report that, and it's a little more
Ministerial estimates.
There you go.
Yeah, perhaps.
So that's another area that there's been a lot of conversation about how do we have some equity in the reporting process as well. But when you look at
all 200 people,
when you're looking at some of the cultural differences though, in some of those places, it's difficult. They don't they don't look at numbers the same way we do in the U.S. And so we have those how we deal with those different systems of administration is a challenge. But great question, yes.
Yeah, it is. And I would just
Good
add, in
observation.
terms of the total number of delegates to General Conference, it's usually closer to, it has been closer to 1,000. But to save cost, the commission, and really the Secretary of the General Conference sets that number, but the Commission on General Conference decided to lower that number, to help save cost.
On the human sexuality, I have a hard time grasping how our church can go against the Supreme Court decision on gay rights and marriage.
Yeah, and I think, and again, this comes back to, as a U.S. issue, that becomes an issue. When you expand that to a global issue, you understand the complexity of our conversations at General Conference. There are some of our friends, in fact, Tim and I had some conversations in Portland with some of our friends from Angola and some other places, Congo especially, where homosexuality is against the law. And so if the church passes legislation that affirms that, they say we can't go back home. And so that's part of the challenge that we have. And culturally, there's just a difference in different places in Africa, and that's not true. And we need to be really clear, I think, and this is one of the things that we've discovered. We tend to lump Africa together, and that's not true. There are different places in Africa that have very different understandings and positions on these issues. But that's the complexity of the conversation we're having to have at General Conference. And so where we're trying to move is to, can we be a denomination where we agree on those things that we do hold together as United Methodist, and then allow other decisions to be made closer to the mission field. And that's where the conversation kind of is right now. And some other folks may want to speak to that as well. But I think that's a sense of where we are in that conversation. And it's a very difficult conversation because we have to be a global church. And so that impacts that conversation more greatly than it just being a U.S. issue. And there's a lot of tension even in some of the proposals to create, a U.S. Central Conference where, because there's a fear that, that's the reason for that is just so that we can deal with the human sexuality question in the U.S. and deal with that. You look at some of the past General Conferences, if it was just the U.S. delegates voting, we probably would have some different language today than we would in the past. And so, yeah, and so, but we have to have that global conversation. And so there's some other folks that may want to address that.
Tom, I want to say, we don't just want to say that it's just Africa, because even here, even though the Supreme Court has spoken, we also remember the Supreme Court speaks for the state, not for the church. But even though the Supreme Court has spoken, if you've been following the news this past week, the struggle in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you have to remember that we also have churches and delegates that will be coming from those places. So it's not even resolved here in America. And hence we have all those different proposals. So be in prayer.
I grew up in the I grew up in the United Methodist Church, and for my entire life, no matter what was going on outside of the church, I always felt like the church was my home and my safe place, a bubble of love and happiness, if you will. It was a place where I could come and be my authentic self and know that I was loved and accepted. In some ways, you could say the church raised me. The United Methodist Church taught me that the greatest commandment is to love my neighbors. The United Methodist Church taught me to love the least of these. The United Methodist Church encouraged me to stand on the side of love and mercy. I deeply love the United Methodist Church. However, when those who are raised within the United Methodist Church learn that we are not actually accepted because our sexual orientation or gender identity is incompatible with Christian teaching, that bubble of love and happiness begins to burst. When we grow up within the United Methodist Church, imagining our wedding in the sanctuary, but later learn that we are not allowed to be married within the walls of the very building that has been our safe place, that bubble begins to burst. When we ask our pastor to perform a marriage, but the pastor, who would like to say yes, is forced to say no to avoid losing his or her credentials, that bubble begins to burst. When we feel the call to ordained ministry, but then learn that our sexual orientation prevents us from answering that call within our own denomination, the bubble bursts. When I consider the damage that is done with the current policies and wording found in our book of discipline, it is hard for me to recognize the church that taught me to love my neighbor, to love the least of these. It is for this reason that I ask you to vote to remove the incompatibility statement in its entirety and from every place it appears in the book of discipline, to remove all language that reduces and confines marriage to opposite sex couples, to make legal the right for pastors to officiate services of Christian marriage for all prepared couples, to remove the officiating of same-sex marriage from the list of chargeable offenses, to remove the hosting of same-sex marriages from the list of chargeable offenses, and to remove all language that prohibits ordination of lesbian and gay persons called to ministry. It's time for us to be the open hearts, open minds, and open doors that we advertise ourselves to be. It's time for us to stand on the side of love.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Oh, microphone's coming.
Amen. Okay, human sexuality, it's one issue of many, right? But on that subject, I posted a funny thing about male pastors on Facebook today. I thought it was funny. And I can't imagine anyone, well, I can imagine someone telling me that I wasn't called to ministry because I'm a woman. If I were not a straight woman, I cannot imagine someone telling me that I could not be ordained in the church I grew up in and love. And I can't imagine my pastor not being able to marry me because of my sexual orientation. I really doubt anyone looks at me and thinks about my sex life. At least I really hope not. And when I look at people, I see children of God and the face of Jesus, and that thought never crosses my mind. So I stand with the young lady back here who just spoke. I would be in favor of the third way, and because I'm not moving to California or any other state, I'm a Texan, transplanted from Ohio, and go Buckeyes. And anyway, that is my feeling. Quite honestly, I haven't discussed it with my church in Arlington, but I know that they respect and trust me as the person appointed to be the leader of the church, the chief spiritual officer. So I just encourage you to think about back in the day when maybe black people couldn't be ordained, or other persons of color or women couldn't be ordained, and just what would Jesus do? Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
During the briefing a while ago, there was a comment about trying to create basically a central conference for the United States, and there wouldn't be any additional expense, or it would save some expense on from the general conference. Would there not have to be in that process a gathering of the United States? And so the question for me becomes, is that statement really true, that it would actually save money? It might save general conference money, but there would be another layer of bureaucracy and structure added, right, that would have to meet at some point.
Well,
Yep.
I'm sorry. Are you going to answer?
I will.
Oh, go ahead, sure.
So There is several proposals on the table that get us to a similar place. There are some of them that, quite frankly, add layers that would cost more. The proposal that Central Texas and North Texas has authored and that we are proposing, what it does is because it limits what General Conference discusses to only general church activities, it would require at most half the time where you're flying delegates from all over the world in. And then that other half of the time you would still need for U.S. issues, but you would only have the expense of the U.S. delegates within the United States. So I'm not suggesting that it's a huge cost savings, but I do think you'd see a cost savings in doing so. Does that help?
It does. And probably at worst, neutral, kind of.
And that's a long-term,
Yeah.
that would be a long-term. Initially, there would be some, I think there would be some additional costs just because that's the way we work.
But there's not another layer. There's not another layer of bureaucracy. Yeah. Now there is a proposal, from the northeastern jurisdiction that has even another judicial layer, and it's very, 72 pages or something. That legislation. Ours is a page. So it's much more.
Save paper.
Yeah, trees, saving trees.
Okay.
Yes.
Could you talk about what would be a U.S. or examples of U.S.-centric issues as opposed to global issues?
Who wants to?
Ethan, you want to take that one?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that are U.S. related. Currently at General Conference, we spend a phenomenal amount of time talking about pension programs and all kinds of things that are related just to U.S. Clergy. We talk about church governing structures. You talk about aspects of the ordination process that are not certainly carried out in other central conferences. And so basically, all of the sections of the discipline that are adaptable, it's like you have people from central conferences coming to the general conference to vote on these things, but then knowing that they can go back home and it's really not going to pertain to them in a sense. And there are some central conferences, annual conferences outside the United States that because of translation issues, they're using books of discipline that are multiple quadrennia old. And so there's really a disconnect there. And so with the U.S. Central Conference proposal, the ability to talk about issues and matters of what it means to be United Methodists on a global scale would not only shorten our time there, but be more fruitful in that we talk about things that are truly United Methodist and Wesleyan rather than sort of how we live that out in our local and unique context.
And if you think of things like just some of the legal issues, like property rights, property issues is a huge thing. We get hung up on, how should a parsonage be? How many appliances do we need in a parsonage? Well, in Africa, they're happy if they, they don't have a parsonage. They don't have a wall. The church is meeting under a tree. I mean, literally. And the pastor gets from one place to another on a bicycle. And so there's just a disparity there, in our conversation. And we don't talk about those things. We spend all, and just imagine sitting at General Conference, if you're from an annual conference, that is coming from a place where your church meets around the tree and you're riding a bicycle there as a pastor. And we're sitting here dealing with, well, should you have a refrigerator and an ice maker in the parsonage? Just think of, and so that's what we're dealing with. And so those are those kind of issues.
Up here. Oh, yes, go ahead. You've got a mic. And then,
You talked about some sort of reform or reorganization of the jurisdictional council.
Judicial council as the third judicial branch that we compare with the Supreme Court. Supreme Court has its basis in the U.S. Constitution. What is the basis of decision-making? What is the foundation, the form that they go back to when how they judge things and how they decide what they are going to even rule on? And what is the discussion about the Reformation I'll be
of
glad
that
to take
council?
that.
It's all yours.
Yeah, we're not touching it.
Yeah. I serve as first clergy alternate on the Judicial Council, and have served on 5 of the last 7 dockets. And it functions very much like the Supreme Court in many ways. Has 9 members. And what it's looking at is, sorry?
We're going to go to 8.
No, we're not going to 8, but yeah, right. I mean, I hope not, you know. But we digress. So what it's acting on is whether generally what is acted on are bishops' decisions of law. And so what happens in an annual conference session when a bishop makes a ruling on a matter of law, somebody calls for a ruling on a matter of law, some action of the annual conference, somebody questions, then the bishop has to make a ruling on that, and automatically that ruling goes to Judicial Council. It becomes church law if the Judicial Council upholds the ruling, or affirms is the language we use, affirms the ruling of the bishop. So, for example, somebody might question an action taken by the annual conference, whether it was in accordance with a certain paragraph in the Book of Discipline. And then the bishop rules on whether or not it was in accordance. And then the Judicial Council reviews that decision of law and either affirms, modifies, or reverses that decision of law. And most of what the Judicial Council deals with is that. Now, there are also declaratory decisions, and there is one coming up before the Judicial Council at the session just before General Conference begins. Judicial Council always meets the week before General Conference, and of course it meets during General Conference to act on constitutionality matters, anything that's referred from the General Conference to it. So in this case, that Plan UMC revised that the Judicial Council overturned in 2012 in Tampa, that is before we had an oral hearing in which we heard presentations on the revised Plan UMC because it was referred to the Judicial Council by the Council of Bishops. The Council of Bishops is able to ask for a declaratory decision, and they did. The Judicial Council decided to defer that until this session just before General Conference meets. And that was done because of the possibility of other declaratory decisions coming to, requests for declaratory decisions coming to Judicial Council. An annual conference can ask for a declaratory decision on a matter of law if it pertains to the work of the annual conference. So those are the kinds of things. Constitutionality, of course, is often what the Judicial Council is doing. It's something constitutional. So that's really how now the reform issue is. There are people who are not happy with some of the Judicial Council decisions. And particularly a lot of unhappiness with the overturning of Plan UMC at the end of General Conference in 2012. But there have been there's other unhappiness there. And so there is a proposal that the General Conference could vote to overturn a Judicial Council decision. And that's going to be ruled unconstitutional by the Judicial Council because of separation of powers. But that is a proposal, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But I think that's the only reform on Judicial Council that's there, right? As far as I know, yeah.
Okay, my question is just a clarification, really. When we talk about connectional, and the United Methodist Church being connectional, and we look at these other churches, kind of going back to the human sexuality issue, is that what I can get out of this is that's what's making this issue so difficult within the United Methodist Church is because of our connectional thing versus the other denominations that have moved forward in the areas of same-sex marriages, ministers being ordained, that type of thing, like within the Presbyterian Church or the Disciples. I guess I just like a little bit of clarification. Are we the only connectional denomination?
We may be the only one that's global in the way that we are. I think we are. You know, the Episcopal Church, for example, is part of the larger Anglican, you know, communion, but it is its own denomination. And then when you start talking about other denominations like Disciples of Christ, Presbyterian, they're really U.S. denominations.
Oh.
We are a global church, and so that does make us different. We're global in a way that's different from the Episcopal Church.
And
You know what I'm
we
saying?
don't have a central, you know, we don't have a central leader.
Yeah.
General Conference is the only body that can speak for the denomination, which, again, that creates part of the issue because we only meet every 4 years for 2 weeks. And so, but that's the only body that can actually speak for the denomination. And so that creates a unique dynamic, I think, for us as a denomination as well.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or statements you'd like to make or comments? Yes. Microphone's on its way.
I wanted to know, are there any petitions or plans in the works to add more diversity to the global look of the United Methodist Church?
Yeah, somebody want to address that?
Can I ask a question of clarification? I mean, as a global denomination with literally representatives from all over the world, done kind of on a representational basis, but not fully, the diversity at General Conference is, it seems fairly diverse when you're there. So I guess what kind of diversity are you referring to, and what areas of that would you like us to address?
When I speak of diversity, I'm speaking in terms of diversity and ethnicity, in terms of seeing more persons of color or more women serving in higher forms of leadership within our denomination.
Yeah, you know, I'm sitting here trying to think if there are particular legislative, you know, pieces to that. I can tell you that at the General Conference, there are monitors who really do a very good job of monitoring our conversations and who speaks and how often they speak and who gets recognized and so forth, so that the effort is to hold the General Conference accountable to make sure all the voices are heard to the extent that that's possible. So, but in terms of legislation, somebody help me if
Well, I was just going to speak to the monitor.
yeah, please, go ahead, Mary.
Well, just to enhance that, the monitors literally stand up at the end of a session before you break in whatever group you're in, and they hold up their piece of paper and they tell you what the demographic breakdown is of all the people that spoke and had to turn at the mic or whatever. So it is continually held in front of us. There is the only legislative piece that I am familiar with is it's very hidden, is the guaranteed appointment legislation. In 2012, while General Conference did decide in a fashion to do away with the guaranteed appointment system, that was overturned after the conference ended. And so that'll no doubt be back on the table this time. But there are some who are see that as a protection for women, for people of color, for people who may be at a disadvantage in their pastoral setting with their Episcopal leadership as far as the kind of appointment they can serve or their ability to serve. if their appointment is not guaranteed. So that one's not super obvious that it's a diversity legislation, but it is seen by many to be so.
Wait, hang on just a minute, Deborah, and then Lewis.
I don't know how you're speaking of diversity, but I think to echo what Tim is saying is that the worldwide nature of the church and what you see at the General Conference, the look of the church is totally different than what you may see in our annual conference or across U.S. jurisdiction, say like the South Central jurisdiction versus the Northeastern jurisdiction or even the Western jurisdiction. In terms of legislation that would address, Mary talks about in the guaranteed appointment, kind of like maybe in a hidden way, but I think the place where the representation in terms of ethnic diversity happens is with GCOR, and then the issue with women would be, GCOR stands for the General Commission on Religion and Race, and then for women would be with COSRO, which is the General Commission on Women. So, and there is part of Plan UMC has the representing of the plan is to combine those two. There is concern from other places that when you combine those two, that it might even dilute their voices and their representation to be in terms of being able to speak. So those are the three places that I would think that the issue of diversity will be or can be or in different ways addressed during General Conference.
Thank you. Lewis?
I just want to echo that same sentiment that a lot of that comes out of the general agencies. It's not necessarily legislatively driven. And so, for instance, we were just in a meeting with GCOR, who's trying to develop information to be able to educate different annual conferences as it relates to cross-racial appointments and things of that nature. How do you prepare a cabinet? How do you prepare a jurisdiction around those types of appointments? And so that's where a lot of that work happens.
And I would say also, and Tim and I experienced this in Portland at the pre-general conference briefing, and I think it's a deeper issue too. I mean, because you look at our denomination in the U.S., and we're not doing a very good job, there. And so I think part of it's we don't have the people to put into leadership, to create that diversity. But there was a lot of conversation at the pre-general conference briefing about just how we frame our conversation about that as well, and being intentional in our conversation about that and how we frame our conversation. I was looking back at some of my notes, and it was and some of those things that we talked about in some of the restructuring proposals was being actively listening, being respectful of the difference, and embracing the diversity, intentionally inclusive of all. One of the comments that one of the folks made that was really poignant to me, and he said, "It's okay if you live in my neighborhood." We hear that a lot, from particularly those of us in a white privileged position, but say, "It's okay if you live in my neighborhood." But the response is, "But I live in your neighborhood and I'm not okay." And so how do we, how do we engage that conversation? And so I think there is one of the things that I think we did hear at the pre-general conference briefing is there is going to be more intentionality on how we frame our conversations. And that sensitivity. And I hope that does prevail at this general conference. But there is some intentionality about that as we move into that. So hopefully that will impact some of those legislative decisions as well on that. So.
I want to add very simply, we have a lot of work to do. Just clearly, I look at our conference and look across the country and the lack of Spanish-speaking United Methodist congregations in a country where Spanish is growing and growing in popularity and use. It's shocking. But I also think part of it, I was ordained back in 1983, and 25% of my ordination class was white male. was in the Chicago area. So, I mean, I think it's not clear cut in terms of who's where and why, but as the chair of the Board of Ordained Ministry, I would tell you that we have a long way to go also in terms of how we deal with enabling, supporting, equipping, recruiting folks of a great deal of variety and backgrounds, and helping them to be in leadership. But it's something we got to do together.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm interested in the issues dealing with the bishops. Are they in the conversation at this time?
This is in terms of reforming the episcopacy in some way? Yeah, well, certainly, yeah, they're in the conversation. I think the main issue there is term episcopacy. This is not the first time there's been, I don't know when that first came before General Conference, but there was legislation last time, it's back again this time, to make the episcopacy not a lifetime episcopacy, but a term episcopacy. Interestingly, you may not know this, but in the central conferences, there is term episcopacy. And it's a little bit different depending on what central conference you're in, but you know, if you're elected and you retire as a bishop, you remain a bishop for life. But if your term is up, then you go back to a local church, you're not a bishop anymore. It's a little bit odd in a way. But that's how it works, and then you're eligible for re-election once. Well, I guess that depends really on how the Central Conference decides to do it. But in some instances, you're eligible for re-election one time, and you know it may be different. So again, this is a place where the Central Conferences get to make decisions about how they do things. A term episcopacy would one of the arguments for it has to do with accountability. One of the arguments has to do with making it consistent with the central conferences. But there are also real challenges with term episcopacy. And I'm sorry?
Diversity of age as well.
And diversity of age. Because right now, if you're elected, you know, at 42 as a bishop, you're going to serve 30 years. You know, I mean, that's a long time. I mean, you might retire a little earlier than that, but you're eligible to go 30 years. So, so that would be a factor. The challenges have to do with, and y'all can just chime in. I mean, but you know, going through the process of election again, when a bishop is trying to bish at the same time, you know, and the distraction of that, and you know, perhaps that's an issue. You know, you certainly want to be careful in terms of the length of the term, because when you're really doing deep change, you know, bishops need to have time to do that. You don't want to make the term too short for them, and that's why now a bishop can serve 12 years instead of just 8, without having to have, you know, 2/3 vote of the jurisdictional conference. It's just a recognition that given the complexities of leadership, there generally needs to be, we've learned that longer tenures are better. Anyway, those are just my comments about that. Yeah, are there other aspects of Episcopal reform that I'm not thinking about? That I think it's just the term episcopacy piece, I guess. Yeah.
Okay. I have a lifetime certificate to teach mathematics and Spanish in the state of Texas, pero hablo español solo un poco. Pero on the subject of guaranteed appointment, I'm going to be fine regardless of if we have guaranteed appointment or not. But I've been told that for some people, they want to get rid of that in order to get rid of less effective pastors. So my question is, aren't there ways of helping persons find another path if their calling has changed, or perhaps that wasn't their calling in the first place? I mean, can you speak to that issue of
Jim.
guaranteed appointment at all?
Our Board of Ordained Ministry folks.
Yeah, and feel free to jump in, the rest of the board that's up here at the tables. The way to, there's a very specific way that clergy are removed, and it more often it's based on tragic decisions than a repetition of ineffective years in the ministry. There's been some developments that have allowed for some graceful exits from the ministry that just came out at the last general conference and has been used sparingly, but has actually been a relief for some conferences and some pastors. But the way that clergy are removed, it really very much is a joint opportunity that the cabinet has with the Board of Ordained Ministry to be able to monitor ineffectiveness and then to be able to deal with that in a way that gives the clergy person a chance to change, or that the follow-through leads to them being asked to turn in their orders. It happens very rarely, or it has happened very rarely.
So where's the accountability to the persons who are overseeing?
Well,
and this may not have to do with general conference, although guaranteed appointment does. So.
I think the main reason why some folks would like to remove the general idea of guaranteed appointment is because our current process in reality is almost impossible. It's not impossible, but it is very difficult. And if someone wants to fight you on it, it becomes almost impossible. And so the idea of right now there is the graceful exit process that if someone chooses to change vocations, we actually have quite a good process that allows that to happen if it's their choice. But if it's a pattern of ineffectiveness, as Jim said, and you have to prove and document that over the number of years and almost find something that, well, you do have to find something that's chargeable in the midst of that, it is practically almost impossible the way it is now. There are some annual conferences that have put people in charge of taking the 4 or 5 most incompetent people in the conference every year and taking them all the way through the process and removing them. And they are able to do it, but it takes a full-time job or 2 of people only focusing on that to go through all of the steps that it takes to get them there. And
so it's a matter of finances?
It's a stewardship issue.
Okay, so the church who is suffering, if the process is there, if it's in the book of discipline, wherever it is, and we don't have the courage to follow through, then what's the point? Rip those pages out.
I think it's a both and, because you have a multiple layered system. If a local church in just 1 year says that this person was great, you give that person ammunition to say, hey, this year was a good year versus that year being a bad year, in addition to the hierarchy in that with the district superintendents and the cabinet doing their reporting. So it's a multi-layered level of that, and you're trying to find a sweet spot to try to find a way to get out of that situation in our leadership. And so it really is more difficult than just performance. It has to be a real track record there.
I'm sorry. Can I speak to the accountability issue?
Please.
I served on the Higher Education and Ministry Committee last General Conference, and in committee, an amendment was made to the proposed legislation and worked very hard on to create a lot more accountability than we currently have. And so that was one of the things that came alongside. You know, you hear, oh, do away with guaranteed appointment, like it's just the bishop's going to wake up one day and look at a list and decide who doesn't have a job anymore. And it was never like that. The original legislation was, people were concerned that it didn't have enough accountability. So a lot more was built into it. Things that aren't in the discipline now. Committees that would be formed for each annual conference, and who would be on those committees, and what the process would be to evaluate clergy that we had concerns about, that the cabinet had concerns about. So actually, it's not a question, I think, of ripping out pages in the discipline. This legislation actually created some things that aren't in there. Now, the legislation then, went off the table. But I think the accountability is lacking in the Book of Discipline, and that legislation was going to put it in there.
For us, it's a joint, again, the Board of Ordinary Ministry, as of 4 years ago, has more responsibility now in terms of helping to monitor clergy effectiveness. And, the vital statistics and everything that churches are filling out, that's a way, again, of monitoring effectiveness and fruitfulness in ways that we haven't done it before. I would probably argue that it's not a matter of courage that's necessary to remove somebody from the office of pastoral responsibilities. It's just documentation. And I think that was the hope of many, that the doing away with guaranteed appointments would take away some of that great comfort zone of, well, it doesn't matter what I do, I'll always have an appointment. And that's not, it wasn't designed, I think, to get rid of any particular age or station of ministry, because I'm frankly, as an older white male, I think it would have been as directed as at us as it would have been anybody. But things have changed in the last 4 years, and I think will continue to change as the board takes more responsibility in working with the cabinet and monitoring effectiveness. And as with more and more churches that are closing, I mean, there'll be less positions. We'll be forced to keep faithful and monitoring.
And more retirements.
Exactly.
Can you, and again, it's getting late, the documentation, what did you mean by that, about the documentation?
Sure. I mean,
you can tell me later if you want.
No, I mean, documentation, just a record of ineffectiveness. That you were
Right.
The district superintendent meeting with a clergy member and saying, these are 3 areas you need to
Right.
work on. To say your staff parishes report this, we've told you the same thing,
Right.
and you didn't do it. Okay,
Right.
That's the documentation you need when there's charges.
I understand. I was a teacher. I know a lot about documentation.
I think in addition to that,
CYA.
as far as it relates to our annual conference, we're seeing coming out of the Center for Leadership, I forget his name that they just hired.
Jeff Roper.
Jeff Roper is developing a plan of leadership development to deal with those different areas as it relates to the effectiveness of clergy. And so as that plan is rolling out, that will add another layer of tangible accountability to how we function.
Yeah. We have one more. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, I want to first, is it on there, add my request, as the young lady here spoke so eloquently, for all of you to vote to remove all restrictive language regarding homosexuality. And I know we're late, so I'll send you an email with more info on that. And one of my concerns with the church, the big global church, United Methodist Church as well as greater Christianity, is the concern of sort of losing the PR battle. And I know we all don't agree on exactly what the essentials of Christianity are, but so much of, quote, evangelical Christianity comes across as, rich, older, straight white males and things of that. And so as Tom mentioned, with the General Conference being the only place to speak for the entire denomination, I guess I want to encourage you, all of you as members, to do everything you can to make sure that the gospel, that we continue to sort of fight this negative PR battle, I would say. And then maybe you can comment on your roles as how we can do this. And speaking for the church, I know I'm excited about Pope Francis. We don't have a pope that can come out and do this all the time. But anyway, I just want to kind of throw that out and encourage you, and glad that you are representing us all in that manner.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Well, I think it's 8:30. Is it? Yes.
Yes.
And so I had said we would go until 8:30, so we need to adjourn. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank all of you who shared with us, and thank you for not only for your presence, but for your passion and love for the church and for God's people. and for Christ, and you have expressed that, those of you who spoke to us beautifully. We thank you for that. And there is that email address. Please make use of it. Spread the word. Let people know if they want to communicate anything at all to us as a delegation. There is that way to do that. And also the website, that there's a link to that on the conference website that Jason Valenti has set up. And as we move closer to General Conference and as we move into General Conference, there are many ways for you to keep in touch with what's going on in the General Conference sessions. If you really want to, you can watch those sessions live streamed. Just remember, this is a legislative process. And Will Rogers famously said, if you love sausage and you respect the law, you should not watch either one being made.
Although I will say, if you can watch the opening worship,
yes,
is phenomenal. Yes. So if you get a chance
to
watch the opening worship.
Yes, it is. It really is, yeah. And not just opening worship. There are other moments of worship that are very powerful, and it's very well done. And anyway, those are available to you. And so I hope that you'll take advantage of that. And thanks again for your presence being here. Appreciate it. Oh, I want to say Mike Ramsdale is sitting over here, and he will be the new district superintendent of the North District. And Mike, glad you're here this evening. Welcome. He crossed over from the East District to come and be with us. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Let me ask you, would you mind leading us in prayer as we adjourn? Yeah, come on up here. Or unless someone's got one handy. Yeah, come on up here. That's all right. Grab one of these. Yep.
Well, let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your presence here and all that we've thought and said and shared and talked about and dreamed about and hoped. We love our church. We love what you've done in our lives and our church and how we served our church as well in the world that you've given us to bless. And so we simply commit and know you're doing something in our conference, in our districts, in our churches, in our lives, General Conference, and all the world. Especially, God, the United Methodist Church, the church that you called us to serve in and among. And our prayers for that blessing in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, Mike. Oh, please, there are cookies if you haven't found those yet.